The morning they announced the Veldre race, the frost on the cobblestones was thick enough to crack under my worn leather boots. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon of the Veldmore Pack lands, I was already covered in mud. It was not the dignified mud of a battlefield. It was not the kind that clings to a warrior's armor after a hard-won victory. No, this was the freezing, foul-smelling slurry kicked up from the hooves of Lord Cedric's purebred stallion. I was carrying a heavy wooden bucket of water from the courtyard well to the eastern stables when he rode past. He did not slow down. His mount barely acknowledged that a person stood in its path. The massive horse surged forward, its flank nearly clipping my shoulder. I stumbled sideways to avoid being trampled. The heavy bucket slipped from my numb fingers. It hit the stone with a sharp crack, sending a wave of freezing water rushing over my boots and soaking the hem of my plain brown tunic. "Watch yourself, Omega," one of Cedric's royal guards laughed from horseback, pulling his mount to a trot beside the lord. "The mud suits you better than the stables anyway." Lord Cedric did not even turn his head. To a man of his standing, an indebted stable hand was no more visible than the stones beneath his horse's hooves. They rode on toward the inner keep, their laughter lingering in the biting morning air. I stood there for a long moment. The freezing water seeped through the thin, worn leather of my boots, chilling me to the bone. Around me, the castle grounds hummed with the usual morning chaos. Servants rushing with firewood, stable hands shouting across the yard. A few of them looked at me with pity. Most looked away. In the Veldmore Pack, showing sympathy to an Omega marked by debt was a dangerous game. I did not cry. I had learned a long time ago that the mud dries, the cold passes, and surviving required a very particular kind of stubbornness. The quiet kind. The kind that does not shout or demand to be seen, but simply refuses to disappear. I wiped a splatter of dirt from my cheek, straightened my spine, and reached down to pick up the empty bucket. As I stood, the fine hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The heavy, metallic tang of an alpha aura pressed suddenly against the courtyard, dropping the temperature of the air. It was a suffocating, vibrating tension that demanded absolute stillness. I slowly lifted my gaze to the high stone balcony of the inner keep. King Aidan stood there. He was framed by the amber light of the burning braziers behind him, dressed in a charcoal formal riding coat with the silver wolf of Veldmore embroidered on the collar. He was a man who commanded a room without having to speak, his broad shoulders grounded, his posture absolute. The Alpha King of Veldmore was not a ruler of vanity. He was a ruler of lethal, cold law. He was looking directly at me. Across the vast distance of the courtyard, through the mist of the morning breath, his storm-gray eyes were locked onto mine. There was no pity in his stare, no mockery. It was an unreadable, piercing weight. For a fraction of a second, the faint scent of rain on dry earth and old pine drifted past me, grounding my racing heart into an unnatural state of calm. I did not drop my gaze. I held it, clutching the handle of my empty bucket, refusing to shrink. Before either of us could look away, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the war drums shattered the silence. 3 beats. Slow. Deliberate. The drums only sounded when the Alpha King had something to announce to the entire pack. By the time I refilled my bucket and returned to the eastern paddock, the news had already spread through the yard like a wildfire. Brahm, the head stable-master, a wide, weathered beta with a thick scar across his jaw, stood near the entrance of the stables. His ARMS were crossed. and he was speaking in low, urgent tones to the senior handlers. "The Veldra race," Brom was saying, his voice rough. "King Aidan himself just decreed it before the morning council." I stopped in my tracks. The water sloshed in my bucket. The Veldra was not a common sporting event. It was an ancient pack law, a brutal test of endurance and riding skill that only happened once every 7 years. It was designed to test the grit of the kingdom's finest warriors. But more importantly, the winner of the Veldra was granted a single binding request, an oath from the Alpha King. No exceptions, no refusals. Anything within reason that the winner named, the crown was bound by sacred law to provide. Land, a title, an elevation in rank, or a debt forgiven. "Who is allowed to enter?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. Brom turned to look at me. He frowned, his eyes scanning my mud-splattered tunic and wet boots. He looked at me the way one looks at a stray dog that suddenly speaks. "Any member of the pack holding the rank of servant or above," Brom grunted, "including stable hands. But don't get any foolish ideas, Maisie. The track crosses the Thornwood, the freezing river, and the eastern cliffs. It breaks trained warriors. It will kill an untrained Omega." He paused, adjusting his heavy leather belt. "Besides, each entrant is given a horse from the royal stable, assigned, not chosen. The king draws the assignments himself on the morning of the race. It prevents the wealthy lords from buying their victory with imported stallions." I nodded slowly, my grip tightening on the handle of the bucket. In my pocket, my fingers brushed against a worn leather riding glove. It had belonged to my father before he lost our family's lands and incurred the massive debt to the crown that had forced me into servitude to keep my younger brother fed. 4 years I had spent invisible in these stables. 4 years of biting my tongue, shoveling manure, and stepping aside into the mud for men like Cedric. A single request, a binding oath from the king. It was enough to clear my father's record entirely. It was enough to buy my family's dignity back. I looked down at my muddy boots, then toward the high balcony where the king had stood. The scent of rain and pine still lingered faintly in my memory. I am not a warrior. I am not a noble. I am an Omega who cleans the stalls of the beasts they ride. But I knew the horses of this yard better than the men who whipped them. I am going to enter, I told myself, the quiet thought solidifying into iron. I am going to ride. The morning of the Veldra race transformed the castle courtyard into a theater of predators. Banners bearing the silver wolf of Veldmore hung heavy in the crisp, freezing air. Stone bleachers lining the outer walls were packed with nobles, pack elders, and guildmasters wrapped in thick furs. The air smelled of wood smoke, nervous sweat, and the sharp copper tang of anticipation. 42 entrants gathered at the starting line. I was the 42nd. I stood at the far edge of the line, the only stable hand in a sea of decorated warriors, elite hunters, and high-ranking nobles. Lord Cedric was there, mounted on a nervous energy, his riding leathers polished to a high gleam. A few paces away stood Heloise, one of the kingdom's finest female warriors. She wore pristine silver-studded armor and carried herself with the flawless posture of someone who had never been told to make herself smaller. I wore my cleanest work clothes, a plain brown tunic, my worn riding breeches, and the same leather boots that still bore the faint, stubborn water stains from Cedric's mud days ago. Tucked safely in my pocket was my father's worn leather glove. I carried no riding crop. I wore no spurs. Heloise glanced at me. Her eyes scanned my clothes, lingering on my boots, before she simply looked away. That silent dismissal was louder than any insult. A sudden hush fell over the courtyard. King Aidan appeared on the raised platform above the starting line. He wore no crown today, only his dark charcoal riding coat, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The absolute authority radiating from him pressed down on the crowd, suffocating the chatter until there was only the sound of the wind. The Veldra is not a test of the horse. King Aidan's voice carried across the stone yard effortlessly, deep and resonant. It is a test of the rider. The assignments are drawn by the crown. They are final. He approached a heavy iron urn on the dais. The drawing began. Names were called one by one. Riders were brought their mounts. Heloise received a magnificent black mare bred for flat-out speed. Cedric drew a massive roan stallion that stamped its hooves with aggressive power. Maisie of the Eastern Stables, the herald announced. The courtyard shifted. A few nobles murmured, leaning in to whisper to one another. King Aidan reached into the iron urn. He pulled a wooden tile, looked at the name carved into it, and then his storm-gray eyes lifted. They found me in the crowd with terrifying precision. He handed the tile to the herald.
Thank you.
"Winter," the herald called out. For a span of 3 heartbeats, the courtyard was silent. Then, a low ripple of laughter began in the noble stands, quickly spreading to the warriors on the starting line. Lord Cedric let out a sharp, mocking chuckle. From the shadows of the stable arches, Brahm led the horse out. Winter was an old, swaybacked gray gelding. His coat was the dull color of dishwater, and his muzzle was white with age. He had a reputation for being entirely useless. He refused to gallop, ignored the whip, and had thrown 2 trained warriors in the past year simply by stopping dead in his tracks and refusing to move. To the pack, drawing Winter was a guaranteed defeat. It was an insult. I ignored the laughter. I ignored Cedric's sneer. I walked forward slowly, keeping my steps measured and calm. I approached the old gray horse and stopped at his shoulder. I didn't grab the reins. Instead, I clicked my tongue, a soft, specific sound I used during the quiet dawns in the east paddock. Winter's ears swiveled. He turned his heavy head toward me and exhaled a long, warm breath against my shoulder. Gently, I pressed my forehead against his velvet nose. "I know," I thought, closing my eyes. "They are watching. Let them." Up on the royal balcony, something shifted. King Aidan's hands tightened on the stone railing. Deep within his chest, his wolf, a vicious, battle-scarred entity that viewed the entire court with paranoid suspicion, suddenly went entirely still. A scent drifted up to the balcony, cutting through the heavy perfume and sweat of the crowd. Rain on dry earth, old pine. It was a scent so grounded, so profoundly peaceful, that the constant weary tension in the king's jaw completely unspooled. It was not a violent physical lust. It was a terrifying, absolute clarity. His wolf locked its focus on the lowly stable hand pressing her forehead to the broken horse. Aidan did not blink. He did not look away. He watched me with an intensity that burned through the freezing air. I swung myself up into Winter's worn saddle. The master of the hunt stepped forward, raising the heavy ram's horn to his lips. The entrants tightened their grips on their reins. Horses danced and reared, infected by the violent, competitive energy of the Alpha Court. Cedric raised his riding crop. Heloise leaned low over her mare's neck. The horn blared, a deafening, guttural blast. The starting line exploded. 41 horses surged forward in a thunder of hooves, flying dirt and screaming riders. They fought for the lead instantly, a chaotic mass of muscle and pack pride, desperate to be first out of the gates. I did not urge Winter forward. I sat back in the saddle, taking a deep breath, and let the reins stay loose. Winter took a single, slow step, then stopped. We watched the entire field of warriors tear away from us, disappearing in a cloud of dust toward the treacherous edge of the thornwood. The crowd in the stands began to laugh again, pointing at the Omega who had seemingly given up before the race even began. They didn't understand. The first lesson I learned in the stables was that the Veldra track does not forgive blind pride. Speed without wisdom is just a faster way to die. "Take your time, old friend," I whispered, patting Winter's gray neck. "Let them run." The roar of the courtyard faded the moment Winter and I crossed the threshold into the thornwood. The ancient forest flanked the castle's eastern grounds. It was a corridor of massive oaks, so tall their canopy swallowed the morning light entirely, leaving only a green-gray dimness. The air here was heavy, smelling of damp earth, crushed leaves, and the lingering tension of the 41 riders who had just torn through it. The first thing you learn about the Veldra track is that it does not forgive hesitation. The second thing you learn is that speed without wisdom is a trap. The track narrowed sharply between the trees. Thick, gnarled roots crossed the path like hidden snares, slick with last night's frost. I let Winter set the pace. We moved at a steady, unhurried trot. His old muscles worked in a rhythm I had felt for 3 years in the quiet mornings of the East Paddock. He was not slow because he was broken. He was slow because he was deliberate. Every placement of his hooves was calculated. Ahead of us, the sounds of the frantic race echoed through the trees. The thunder of hooves, men shouting, the sharp crack of riding crops. Then came the sounds of things going wrong. We rounded a sharp bend and found the first casualty of the thornwood. It was a young nobleman I recognized by his expensive crimson cloak. He was sitting in a ditch, his pristine clothes covered in muck, swearing loudly at his expensive stallion. The horse stood several yards away, its chest heaving in panic, refusing to step near the treacherous root system that had tripped it. The nobleman raised his crop, preparing to strike the frightened animal. "Don't," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the damp air. He whipped his head around, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw the lowly stable hand on the gray horse he had laughed at 10 minutes ago. "Mind your place, Omega," he spat, his face flushed with humiliation. I didn't argue. I didn't stop. I simply guided Winter carefully around the tangled roots, my hands gentle on the reins. I patted Winter's neck, leaving the nobleman stranded in the mud of his own making. Over the next 2 miles, the field thinned drastically. The thornwood was merciless to those who rode with arrogance. I counted 4 more fallen riders. One warrior's horse had balked at a sudden drop, sending its rider tumbling into a pile of wet leaves. Another had pushed his mount too fast over uneven stone, and now stood helplessly as the animal refused to bear weight on a strained leg. The sentinels posted along the track were already moving in to assist them. We broke out of the thornwood and into the sweeping, open meadow that led to the true test of the Veldra, the old river crossing. The river was wide, its current deceptively strong, and its bed lined with slick, moss-covered stones. The freezing water was a terrifying obstacle for an overheated, panicked racehorse. As we approached the banks, I saw the chaos. 8 riders were bottlenecked at the water's edge. Lo, Cedric's roan stallion was plunging and rearing, splashing freezing water everywhere, terrified of the unstable footing. Cedric was red in the face, shouting and driving his spurs into the horse's flanks, trying to force it into the deeper current by sheer dominance. A frightened rider makes a frightened horse. It is a simple law of nature, but men like Cedric never bothered to learn it. I did not force Winter into the chaos. I pulled him up at a quiet section of the bank, 10 yards away from the shouting nobles. I slipped down from the saddle. My worn boots hit the muddy bank. Reaching into my pocket, my fingers brushed the worn leather of my father's glove, a silent reminder of why I was doing this. I stepped forward into the freezing river. The cold was an instant, biting shock that soaked through my breeches and filled my boots. The current pulled at my legs, heavy and relentless. I did not flinch. I waded out until the water was at my knees, then turned back to look at Winter. He stood on the bank, his dark eyes watching me steadily. I did not pull on his reins. I did not shout. I simply clicked my tongue. The soft, familiar invitation. Winter lowered his head, let out a breath, and stepped into the freezing water to join me. We crossed the river together. I walked ahead, testing the slick stones with my boots, and he followed exactly in my footsteps. The current and pushed at his legs, but he leaned into it with the patience of an old creature that knew the world was full of hidden footing. While Cedric and the warriors fought brutal battles of will against their terrified mounts, Winter and I moved through the water with quiet respect. When we reached the far bank, I paused, dripping wet, my hands numb from the cold. I looked back. Only a handful of riders had made it across. Heloise was one of them, her black mare scrambling up the rocky incline ahead of me. Cedric was still trapped on the opposite side, cursing violently as his horse flatly refused to enter the deep water. I pulled myself back into Winter's saddle. My clothes clung to my freezing skin, but inside my chest, a strange, steady warmth was blooming. "Now, Winter," I murmured, leaning forward. "Show them." The track climbed from the river toward the eastern ridge. It was a long, grinding ascent through loose gravel, the kind of terrain that breaks horses who have spent all their energy sprinting in the flat meadows. Winter had conserved everything. His breathing was deep and rhythmic. He didn't panic, he just worked. We crested the ridge where the halfway watchtower stood. A race official in the king's silver livery stood on the platform, holding the tracking flags. He was looking down the trail, expecting to see a dozen elite warriors fighting for position. Instead, he saw a mud-soaked stable hand on a gray-muzzled horse. The official's jaw dropped. The pen slipped from his fingers. The group of noble spectators gathered around the tower fell into absolute, stunned silence. No one laughed. No one whispered. I rode past the official, my posture straight, my chin held high. I was in third place. The second half of the Veldre track was flatter, looping south through the outer village before merging onto the broad King's Road that led straight back to the castle gates. By the time the castle's high stone towers came into view against the gray morning sky, there were only 3 riders left at the front. Gareth, a broad-shouldered elite hunter on a massive chestnut gelding, was laboring in second place. I could see the signs of exhaustion from 50 yards back. The chestnut's stride had shortened, its head dropping incrementally with every step, borrowing from physical reserves it no longer possessed. Gareth pushed harder, his riding crop snapping ruthlessly. The horse stumbled on a loose cobblestone, losing its rhythm and surrendering 20 precious yards. I passed him without a word. Winter's breathing was deep and even, his stride completely unbroken. That left only Heloise. She was 50 yards ahead, leading the race on her magnificent black mare. The villagers lining the stone walls of the King's Road were cheering wildly for her, shouting her name. But as the G between us slowly closed, I saw what Heloise could not see from the saddle. Her mare's ears were pinned flat against its skull, and a subtle, desperate hitch had developed in its left hind leg. The purebred was fading. The towering iron gates of the castle courtyard loomed ahead. The finish line, a thick ribbon of crimson cloth stretched between two wooden posts, waited just inside the yard. The roar of the gathered nobles and warriors swelled into a deafening wall of sound. 30 yards, 20 yards, Heloise heard the rhythmic, steady drum of hooves behind her. She cast a quick glance over her shoulder, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she saw the mud-splattered stable hand and the gray-muzzled horse closing in. I leaned low over Winter's neck. I pressed my hands gently against his coarse mane. I didn't reach for a whip. I didn't dig my heels in. I simply asked. "Now," I whispered. And Winter, the old, swaybacked, discarded gray horse who had thrown warriors and been mocked by the entire kingdom, ran. It was not the desperate, frantic scramble of a dying beast. It was something entirely magnificent. He had been saving it. Every slow step through the thornwood, every patient placement of his hooves in the freezing river had been building to this exact moment. He opened up his stride, and the earth simply vanished beneath us. The wind tore at my hair, freezing my wet clothes against my skin. But all I felt was absolute, soaring freedom. We pulled level with Heloise. For a split second, our eyes met. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a stunned, reluctant realization. Then we pulled ahead. The courtyard erupted. Winter's chest hit the crimson ribbon, snapping it with a sharp crack that echoed over the roaring crowd. I sat back in the saddle, pulling gently on the reins to slow him down. My hands were trembling violently, not from the freezing cold, and not from exhaustion, but from something buried deep inside my chest that had finally, violently broken free. I rested my face against Winter's neck, letting out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs for 4 years. Total chaos consumed the courtyard. Men were shouting, nobles were standing on their stone benches in disbelief, and stable hands were staring with their mouths open. I lifted my head. Above the roaring crowd, on the high royal balcony, King Aidan stood completely still. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking only at me. His storm-gray eyes burned with an intensity that made the freezing air feel heavy. There was no mockery in his gaze, no political calculation. It was raw, unmasked respect. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King of Veldmore lowered his head in a singular, profound nod. "Bring her to the King's Hall," his voice echoed across the yard, carrying a weight that instantly silenced the clamor. I was escorted by 2 elite royal guards in silver armor. I did not have time to change my clothes. I walked through the ancient, towering corridors of the inner keep with my boots squelching, leaving a faint trail of muddy river water on the pristine stone floors. I kept my chin high, my hand resting over the pocket where my father's glove sat. The king's hall was vast, built of dark, ancient stone and illuminated by 2 massive hearths that bathed the room in an amber glow. King Aidan was standing by the heavy oak map table in the center of the room. He had dismissed his council. We were completely alone, save for the crackling of the fire. He turned as I entered. Up close, the sheer, crushing pressure of his alpha aura was staggering, yet it did not feel aggressive. It felt like a shield. "Your Majesty," I said, offering a stiff, respectful bow. "Maisie," he said, just my name, spoken in a low, resonant register that sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "You rode a horse that every trained warrior in this pack refused to touch, and you broke the kingdom's finest." "Winter is a good horse," I said softly, my voice steady despite my shivering frame. "He just requires a rider who listens." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. A rare trait in this court. He stepped closer, the warmth of his proximity cutting through the freezing chill of my wet cloth. "The law of the Veldra is absolute. You won. The prize stands. One request, binding by the oath of the crown. Name it." I did not hesitate. "My father's debt to the crown. I ask that it be forgiven in full." The record struck. Aidan looked at me, his gaze searching my face in the amber firelight. "You ask for nothing for yourself? No gold? No title? You could elevate your own standing in an instant." "My family's dignity is my standing, Your Majesty," I replied, holding his gray eyes. "I only want what was unfairly taken from us." Silence stretched between us, thick and charged. "It is done," Aidan commanded, his voice absolute. "The debt will be struck from the records tonight. Your father is a free man." A wave of overwhelming relief threatened to collapse my knees, but I held myself rigid. "Thank you, Your Maj." "I am not finished," Aidan interrupted smoothly. He moved to his desk, picking up a heavy parchment. "Brahm's logs show you have tended to the most difficult animals in the yard for 3 years. You understand the beasts of this pack better than the master of the hunt." He held the parchment out to me. It bore the heavy silver wax seal of the king. "Effective immediately, you are elevated to senior handler of the East Paddock. You will oversee all royal rehabilitation. You answer only to Brahm and to me." I stared at the parchment, my breath catching in my throat. This was not a request I had made. This was the Alpha King actively wielding his power to protect my worth. "The court will not like this," I whispered. "I am the king," Aidan replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "The court will learn to adapt." Down in the lower corridors, far from the warmth of the amber firelight, Lord Cedric finally rode into the castle courtyard. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive armor ruined, his roan stallion limping. He had placed 6th. As he dismounted, a sycophantic beta noble rushed to his side, whispering the news of my victory and my sudden elevation in rank. Cedric froze. His face contorted, turning a mottled, furious red. He looked up toward the king's hall, his fists clenching so hard his leather gloves creaked. "A stable hand does not dictate the hierarchy of Veldmore," Cedric hissed into the shadows, his voice dripping with venom. "If the king wishes to play favorites with an Omega, then we will simply have to prove to the pack that the king is a cheat." The weeks following the Veldra race were strange in the specific, quiet way that a castle changes when the hierarchy is violently disrupted, but no one is allowed to speak of it. I did not move into the castle proper. I politely declined the upgraded servants' quarters, choosing instead to remain near the east paddock where the rehabilitation horses were kept. My clothes were cleaner now, a sturdy, warm wool tunic provided by the crown, bearing the small bronze insignia of a senior handler. But my hands remained calloused, and my boots still found the mud. My father had received the royal decree erasing his debt. The letter he sent back was brief, stained with tears I could only imagine, but the overwhelming relief in his words grounded me every time the court's hostility threatened to pull me under. And the hostility was immense. In Veldmore, an Omega elevating herself through labor and grit was an anomaly. But an Omega receiving the Alpha King's direct public backing, that was a threat. The nobles began to freeze me out. When I crossed the courtyard to deliver feeding reports, the high-ranking betas and aristocrats would stop talking, turning their backs as I passed. Lord Cedric's men would deliberately knock over water buckets near my boots, or accidentally release untrained hounds near the fragile, recovering horses in my paddock. I ignored all of it. I picked up the buckets. I calmed the hounds. I did the work. I knew better than to react, because reacting was exactly what Cedric was. He was a man who had built his entire life on the assumption that certain people belonged in certain places, and I had moved. Movements like mine were contagious, and Cedric intended to cut the infection out at the root. Since he could not attack me directly, not with the king's heavy silver seal stamped on my new position, he chose to attack the one thing that protected me, the legitimacy of the Veldra race itself. It started as a whisper in the stone corridors, a rumor cultivated with the precision of a slow-acting poison. How does the lowest stable hand pull the exact horse she has spent 3 years training? Cedric's sycophants would murmur during the evening feasts, making sure their voices carried just far enough. 42 entrants, 42 horses, and the Omega draws the one beast that knows her touch? The king drew those lots with his own hands. Did you not see the way he looked at her on the balcony? The insinuation was dangerous. Cedric was not just insulting me. He was accusing Alpha King Aiden of manipulating sacred pack law to favor a lowly servant. To the ancient wolves of the council, interfering with the Veldra was a crime against the pack's founding traditions. One freezing afternoon, as the sky turned the color of bruised iron, I was in the east paddock brushing winter's dull gray sea oat. He leaned his heavy head against my shoulder, his breathing slow and peaceful. I paused, my brush hovering in mid-air. The fine hairs on my arms stood up. I turned around to find someone standing on the other side of the wooden fence. It was not one of Cedric's sneering guards. It was Heloise. The fierce warrior woman wore her silver-studded armor, a heavy fur cloak draped over her shoulders to ward off the biting wind. Her blonde hair was braided tightly against her scalp. She watched me with the same intense, calculating eyes that she had used on the starting line. I did not step back. I rested my hand on Winter's neck, slipping my other hand into my pocket to touch the familiar worn leather of my father's glove. I have been watching you, Heloise said, her voice sharp and carrying over the wind. I am aware, Lady Heloise, I replied evenly. She studied the bronze insignia on my tunic, then looked at Winter. I spent 4 months training for the Veldra. I fed my mare the finest oats in the kingdom. I memorized every root in the thornwood. She paused, her jaw tightening. And you beat me on a swaybacked gelding that looks like he belongs in a rendering vat. He was the horse I was given, I said simply, and he ran the race he was meant to run. For a long moment, Heloise said nothing. The wind whipped her fur cloak around her armored shoulders, and unexpectedly, the hard line of her mouth softened into something resembling grudging respect. Yes, he did, she said quietly. And you rode him well. I lost fairly. I am a warrior of Veldmore, and I know how to swallow a clean defeat. She took a step closer to the fence, her tone dropping into a low, urgent murmur. But Lord Cedric does not. I stiffened. What has he done? He has bought 3 members of the Elder Council, Heloise warned, her eyes darting quickly toward the castle to ensure we were not overheard. He paid off one of Brom's assistant record keepers to steal the paddock logs. Cedric is going to use your daily presence in Winter's care logs, combined with the King's draw, to argue that the assignment was predetermined. A cold weight dropped into my stomach. He needs a majority vote to call an emergency trial, Heloise continued. He secured it an hour ago. He has officially petitioned the Winter Council to review the Veldra results. He wants your victory voided. He wants the debt forgiveness revoked. And he wants King Aidan publicly censured for breaking pack law. I stared at her, my mind racing. If the victory was voided, my father's debt would instantly return. The crushing weight that had suffocated my family for 4 years would be dropped right back onto our necks. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice tight. You came in second. If my victory is voided, the crown falls to you. You get the king's oath. Heloise's eyes flashed with fierce, untamed pride. Because I am a warrior, not a scavenger. I do not take trophies from the hands of cowards who fight with forged whispers and bought votes. You won that race. I saw it. The pack saw it. She turned to leave, pulling her fur cloak tighter around her neck. The Emergency Winter Council convenes at sundown tomorrow. Head up, Maisie. If you let Cedric see you bleed, the sharks in this court will tear you to pieces. She walked away, leaving me alone in the freezing paddock. Winter nudged my shoulder, a soft, questioning huff leaving his nostrils. I rested my forehead against his neck, closing my eyes against the biting wind. The velvet trap had snapped shut. Cedric thought he could crush me by using the law, completely underestimating the fact that a girl who had survived 4 years at the bottom of the pack knew exactly how to fight in the dark. The great hall of Veldmore was built to intimidate. Its vaulted ceilings vanished into the shadows, supported by massive pillars of black stone carved with the ancient laws of the pack. 2 enormous hearths roared at either end of the chamber, casting long, dancing amber shadows across the faces of the wolf elders, seated in a semicircle around the king's dais. When the heavy oak doors groaned open to admit me, the silence in the room was absolute. I walked down the center aisle alone. I wore the sturdy wool tunic of my new rank, the bronze senior handler insignia catching the firelight. I did not hurry my steps. I kept my gaze straight ahead, my hand resting gently in my pocket, my fingers curled around my father's worn leather glove. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, expensive oils, and the sharp, aggressive pheromones of dozens of high-ranking wolves who viewed my presence as an insult to their bloodlines. At the far end of the hall, Alpha King Aiden sat upon the obsidian throne. He wore the heavy, fur-lined mantle of his station. His storm-gray eyes locked onto me the moment I entered, and once again the crushing, paranoid tension of the room seemed to fracture. The faint scent of rain on pine drifted through the hall, a silent, grounding anchor that steadied my breathing. He did not smile, nor did he offer any visible comfort. He was the lawgiver tonight. Lord Cedric stood at the center of the floor, holding a stack of parchment. He looked supremely confident, his chin raised in arrogant triumph. "Step forward, Omega," Cedric commanded, as if he sat on the throne himself. I walked until I stood precisely 10 paces from the dais, stopping on the silver wolf crest carved into the floor. "Your Majesty, honored elders," Cedric began, his voice oiled and echoing off the stone walls. "We are gathered tonight to rectify a grievous wound to our pack's honor. The Veldra race has stood for 300 years as a pure test of our warriors. Yet, 3 weeks ago, this sacred tradition was mocked." He dramatically threw the stack of parchments onto the long table before the elders. "These are the care logs from the East Paddock, copied by a loyal servant of the crown," Cedric announced, turning to glare at me. "They prove that this stable hand, Maisie, has been the sole caretaker of the gray horse, Winter, for 3 entire years. She knew the beast's temperament. She knew its stride. She had an illegal, intimate understanding of the mount long before the starting horn blew." Murmurs erupted among the elders. Several of them cast dark, disgusted looks in my direction. "And yet," Cedric's voice rose, theatrical and booming, "out of 42 entrants, out of 42 horses, what are the odds that the king's own hand drew that exact horse for this exact girl? The law of the Veldra demands a random assignment to ensure fairness. I submit to this council that the draw was not random. I submit that it was rigged to favor a servant." The hall erupted into genuine outrage. Accusing the Alpha King of breaking pack law was a dangerous gamble, but Cedric had played his hand perfectly. If Aiden defended me with violence, he proved himself a tyrant. If he stayed silent, he proved Cedric right. I stood perfectly still. I did not look at Cedric. I looked only at the king. Aiden did not shift on his throne. He let the outrage fill the room, let the elders whisper and point, let Cedric bask in his manufactured glory. The king's silence was heavy, cold, and predatory. Slowly the noise in the hall began to die down, suffocated by the sheer, freezing pressure of the alpha aura radiating from the dais. When the room was entirely silent, King Aiden leaned forward. "Are you accusing the crown of cheating, Lord Cedric?" Aiden's voice was dangerously low, a soft rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. Cedric swallowed, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. "I am presenting evidence of an irregularity, Your Majesty. For the purity of the pack law, the Veldra results must be voided. The girl's debt forgiveness must be revoked, and her rank stripped." Aiden stood up. He descended the 3 stone steps of the dais, his heavy mantle sweeping across the stone. He walked over to the table and picked up the care logs. He didn't even look at them before dropping them back onto the wood. "You did not need to bribe a record keeper to find these logs, Cedric." Aidan said coldly. I read them. I read the stable logs every quarter. It is my duty to know the state of my kingdom, down to the lowest paddock. The king turned, his gray eyes sweeping across the elders. 3 years, Aidan's voice rang out, clear and absolute. For 3 years, while my warriors drank in the halls and my lords argued over taxes, this Omega woke before dawn in the freezing cold. She tended to a horse that every single warrior in this room deemed useless. She was kicked, read, and mocked. And yet, she returned to the paddock every single day without being asked, without seeking reward, and without demanding recognition. Aidan turned his gaze to Cedric, and the hostility in the king's eyes made the noble take a physical step back. The Veldra is a test of the rider, Aidan stated, quoting the ancient law word for word. When I drew the lots that morning, I saw the name of a horse that had thrown 2 of my finest elite guards. Handing that horse to any of you would have been a guaranteed defeat, so I made a choice. A collective gasp rippled through the elders. The king was admitting it. I did not cheat to give her an advantage, Aidan said softly, stepping so close to Cedric that the noble began to tremble. I assigned her the hardest test in the yard. I gave her a broken, stubborn beast, because she was the only rider in this entire pack who had earned the right to ride him. She did not win because I gave her a gift. She won because she did the work that the rest of you were too arrogant to do. Aidan turned away from Cedric and looked at me. The amber light caught his face, highlighting the fierce, protective pride in his expression. If rewarding 3 years of unseen loyalty, patience, and grit is a violation of our law, Aidan announced to the silent, stunned hall, then this pack has forgotten what makes a wolf truly strong. Cedric's face was pale, his trap completely dismantled by the king's brutal, irrefutable honesty. Desperate, Cedric stammered, But the law of the draw. The law of the Veldra, a new voice interrupted from the back of the hall. The crowd parted as Heloise strode forward. She wore her full ceremonial armor, her blonde braid falling over her shoulder. She stopped beside me, giving me a brief, respectful nod before looking at the elders. The law of the Veldra dictates that the second-place finisher may formally contest a rigged race, Heloise stated, her voice ringing with the clarity of a veteran warrior. I placed second. And I say the race was clean. The girl rode with honor. The horse ran with the heart of a champion. I concede my claim to the Veldra. She turned to Cedric, her lip curling in disgust. You placed 6th, Cedric. You spent half the race fighting your own horse in a river. You have no right to contest anything. The murmurs from the elders shifted entirely. The mood in the room flipped from outrage against the crown to disgust toward Cedric. King Aidan ascended his throne once more, his storm-gray eyes settling on the trembling lord. Lord Cedric. Aidan's voice was now the cold, sharp blade of the executioner. Pack law strictly forbids a noble from using bribed royal servants to steal crown property, which the paddock logs are. It also forbids bringing a false accusation against a Veldra victor. Cedric's eyes widened in terror. He looked around the room, seeking allies among the elders he had bought, but they were staring firmly at the floor, abandoning him instantly. The velvet trap had not caught the Omega. It had snapped shut around the throat of the noble who built it. The punishment for Lord Cedric was swift, absolute, and entirely bloodless. By the time the sun rose over the Veldmore Pack lands the next morning, Cedric had been formally stripped of his lands, his title, and his seat on the Winter Council. He was banished to the outer borders, reduced to a commoner, his arrogant pride completely broken by the very laws he had tried to manipulate. The sycophants who had aided him quietly retreated into the shadows, terrified of the Alpha King's cold, sweeping justice. 3 days later, the first snow of the season arrived. It did not come as a fierce storm, but as a quiet, steady drifting of white flakes that covered the mud of the courtyard and settled softly on the ancient stone walls. It made the castle look peaceful, muffling the noise of the pack and wrapping the world in a pristine, freezing silence. I was standing in the east paddock, my hands resting on the top rail of the wooden fence. My father's letter was tucked safely in the breast pocket of my wool tunic, right beneath the bronze insignia of my new rank. The debt was gone. My brother was safe. 4 years of carrying a crushing, invisible weight had finally ended, leaving me feeling lighter than the snow falling around me. Winter stood on the other side of the fence, his gray muzzle dusted with white flakes. He pushed his heavy head over the rail, huffing a warm cloud of breath into the freezing air, asking for the apple he knew I had hidden in my pocket. I smiled, pulling the apple out and letting him take it from my flat palm. I heard the footsteps before I saw him, the grounded, unhurried tread of boots crushing the fresh snow. I turned as Alpha King Aiden stopped beside me at the fence. He wore his thick charcoal coat, his dark hair dusted with snow. Without the heavy mantle of the throne, without the amber fires of the great hall, or the suffocating presence of the elders, he looked simply like a man. A very tired, very strong man who had finally found a quiet place to rest. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood together, watching the old gray horse chew his apple. The scent of rain on dry earth and old pine wrapped around me, warm and incredibly safe. The court is very quiet this morning, I said softly, breaking the silence. The court is learning how to adapt, Aiden replied, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He turned his head to look at me, his storm-gray eyes incredibly soft. Heloise has officially requested to assist you with the rehabilitation program in the spring. It seems you have earned the loyalty of my finest warrior. I looked down at my calloused hands. I only did what needed to be done. I didn't ask for any of this to happen. I know, Aiden said, stepping slightly closer. That is precisely why it happened. I have ruled this pack for 7 years. I have been surrounded by people who demand power, who plot for crowns, and who measure their worth by the blood they spill. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently covering mine on the freezing wooden rail. The touch sent a shock wave of profound, grounding heat straight to my heart. My inner wolf, so long kept quiet and hidden, let out a deep, contented sigh. Then I saw you, Aiden continued, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. A girl standing in the freezing mud, holding an empty bucket, refusing to let the cruelty of this pack break her. You didn't ask for a crown, Maisie. You already wore one. A crown of absolute, unshakable dignity. I looked up into his eyes, my breath catching in my throat. There was no royal command in his gaze. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of the mate bond. A bond built not on sudden, blinding magic, but on mutual respect, shared silence, and profound understanding. I am not a noble, Aiden, I said, using his name for the very first time. It hung in the snowy air between us, intimate and heavy. I have no bloodline to offer a king. I do not want a bloodline. I want a partner, Aiden said, his fingers intertwining with my. I want the woman who showed this entire kingdom that true strength is not the speed at which you ride, but the patience with which you endure. He paused, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. I am asking you to stand beside me, not behind me, never beneath me. Winter nudged Aiden's shoulder with his wet nose, letting out a soft snort as if impatient with the slow pace of human conversation. Aiden chuckled, a deep, rich sound that I had never heard before. He reached up with his free hand and gently patted the old horse's neck. Even the beast agrees, the king murmured. I looked at the horse that everyone had rejected, and then at the king who had seen the truth in both of us. A slow, warm smile spread across my face, chasing away the last lingering ghosts of the past 4 years. Then I will stand beside you, I answered softly, stepping into the shelter of his broad shoulder, for as long as the snow falls. Years later, when the elders of the Veldmore Pack recorded the history of King Aiden's reign, they did not write about the wars he fought or the taxes he collected. They wrote about the queen who reshaped the kingdom with quiet, unyielding grace. And in the official royal stable logs, the name Winter was not placed in the column for the broken or the retired. It was placed at the very top of a new page, written in the Queen's own hand. It simply read, "Distinguished." A crown can be stolen, but true dignity can never be buried, or ever. Would you have trusted the Alpha King's protection after the pack had treated you so cruelly for years? If you love emotional stories of rejected mates, protective Alpha Kings, and queens who rise from the ashes with absolute grace, subscribe and stay with us for the next story.